It's a great opportunity for us to connect, even though we're in different places in the world. So it's a great opportunity to join you. That's my topic. Then is going to look two aspects. One is around professional knowledge, teachers' professional knowledge, and given the focus of your program, I've orientated quite a lot to look at the issue of the research methods that we're looking at. I'm going to try and make sure that I keep within the 30 minutes allotted, and we'll welcome questions, and which you could type into the chat, and then I would pick up at the end of the presentation to respond to. So just to give a little bit of context, as the introduction suggests, I'm a professor of education at the University of Sussex in England. The University of Sussex is on the south coast of England, so we are very close to the sea, a university that was set up in the 1960s. And I joined the university in 2000, and my primary responsibility when I joined was to lead the History PGCE, which is a postgraduate course for graduates who want to become history teachers. And I was a history teacher, and I then joined the university in order to train other history teachers. The picture you can see there is the cohort, one of the cohorts that I worked with most recently. And this is on the first day of their training, and you can see them all holding up different objects, different artifacts. And I've used this technique with my history teachers every year, and they hold up the object and they're able to introduce themselves and how the object relates to their own personal history and its place within their development. So it's always been this kind of ice-breaking activity that I've used. And so artifacts, objects, and talking about objects has been part of the practice that I've used with history teachers for many, many years. So the three things that I wanted to share with you, one is to give you a little sense of the professional learning that goes on in teacher education, with a particular focus on history education, which is my subject. I want to share with you a model, a theorized model of professional knowledge, which tries to identify how knowledge and historical knowing is dynamic and historicized within the practice of history teachers and those that I've worked with. And then because of the nature of your program, I wanted to focus in on how I've used artifacts in different qualitative research projects in order to develop that deeper reflection by participants that take place. So those are the three areas that I hope that we'll be able to focus in on today. The screen here is a kind of illustration of different news articles from my country, and what it's showing is the criticism that is leveled at the education system, particularly when it comes to British history. And the teaching of history is a very political subject within England, and one in which politicians from different parties often argue over, and is reflected in newspaper articles which kind of critique and say that history teaching isn't good enough, and young people don't know their history sufficiently. The people that tend to write these have a political agenda, and they have a particular view of how history should be taught. In actual fact, according to our Ofsted inspections, which are the ways in which the quality of teaching is assessed in England, history teaching is of very, very high quality, and the preparation of teachers in that area is excellent. But that doesn't stop the press from critiquing and not doing the kind of history that they would wish it to be. And you wouldn't be surprised to hear that in a country like England, there is a very imperialistic attitude towards history, and one that seeks for the country to take pride in its past, which practicing teachers want to critique and to demonstrate that actually there are limits and failures within our history that need to be acknowledged. So you can see how this is a kind of politicized area for us. And the other thing that's important context is that what we teach and how we teach in England is regulated by our Department for Education, who introduced a national curriculum back in the mid-90s, which has gone through 5 different manifestations, which again always reflects the government's agenda as to what history is, how it should be taught, and the kinds of history that should be taught. And history teachers themselves are often what I would describe fighting a kind of rearguard action to kind of try and keep history teaching and the credibility of that subject within their control. So when I started in my role, I was new to being a teacher educator. And so I've engaged in research projects that have tried to think about what it is that we are doing when we train history teachers and what it is that's happening to history teachers as they develop their professional knowledge. And so I framed that initially as 2 kind of key research questions, which I've been exploring. The first one is what do history teachers know? So what is the professional knowledge of history teachers? When we think about a teacher, what are the different elements of knowledge that they hold? And then the second part of that is to think about how has that developed over time, and what role does things like teacher education, initial teacher education, professional development, informal learning have on the development of that professional knowledge. So it's what is it and how is it framed? How does it come to be? Now, that's manifested in different projects over the years. And the different influences on my work is, first of all, the approach that I've often adopted is one that is very similar to life history methodology. So is using narrative inquiry, getting participants to reflect and share their experiences, sometimes reflecting back over a significant period of an interview, or longitudinally where I return to interview the same person with the same threads at different points in their career. So Goodson, Sykes, Huberman are kind of provide that methodological approach to what it is that I'm working on. As I'm focusing in on professional knowledge, I'm looking at what are the different ways in which others have sought to capture teachers' professional knowledge. And a colleague of mine at the University of Sussex, who sadly passed away, Professor Michael Arrow, has been very influential in my work in thinking about how that's created. Brown and McIntyre Ruthven, and also I'd say Schulman as well is another writer and thinker who's influenced my ideas of what constitutes that professional knowledge. And then finally, that's a kind of a universal level. And then specifically, there are others writing in the field of history teacher education, Husbands, Pedri, Kitson and John, who have previously done research in this particular area, but have tended to focus on experienced teachers of history. And my focus has been, because of the nature of my work, on the early career teachers, so those within the first 2 or 3 years of their career, which is when I've had contact with them. So the scale of the research that I want to talk about first, I'm going to talk about 2 projects, and then I'm just going to introduce a third, which is in train at the moment around the research methods. So what I've approached is a number of case studies. So I've looked at 15 different case studies, essentially looking at the experience and the lived experience of 15 history teachers in different schools in Sussex in my partnership. I've looked at those who I've described as experienced, they're 5 years into their teaching career, 5 that are a year after completing their teacher training, and then 5 who at the time of the research were doing their teacher training themselves. So looked at kind of different levels of experience to see if there's any differences in their experiences and reflections. Now, I work at the University of Sussex, so my sampling is purposive. I want to know what beginning teachers want. It's opportunistic. They are all in my department or been in my department previously, so I have a professional relationship with all of them, and have either taught them or supported them or mentored them at some point in their careers. So I recognise that what I talk about here is framed very much as part of my own history as a teacher educator, and doesn't necessarily represent the experience of all beginning history teachers in the UK. So the way in which I have focused on building up the research is to be inclusive in the research design, and through a series of pilots, I've also realised it's really important to provide some kind of artifact around which the teachers will talk about their practice, which I'll introduce. So the first thing that I did with my case studies is I brought them all together as the research project developed. This is before I had the knowledge that I now did, and kind of shared with them different ways in which the research and scholarship talked about teacher professional knowledge. And I got them to write what I called a professional portrait, which was like a mini CV, a little abstract of their lives leading up to this point, to get them reflecting at the start point. So we were all together, all 15 teachers and myself, in a kind of workshop where we looked at different models. So we were all able to talk the same language as the research began. Then the second part, and this is where the pilot was so important, is that initially I just interviewed one of the teachers about their lives and experience and knowledge of history teaching, but it was quite a stilted experience. So what I built into the final design was an observation of their teaching. And the purpose of that observation was not, as it is in many teacher education experiences, to kind of assess the quality of their teaching. It was so that both myself and the participant had a focus for our discussion. So the lesson that they taught and our reflections on the observation and the lesson plans and the materials they used and the pupils' work where we had it became an artifact about which we would talk. And what that did was that unlocked a much deeper discussion of what they had been doing as history teachers over the last 1 to 5 years. It provided example, and teachers felt much more freer, and the answers that they gave were much more concrete than when I first approached them just to interview them without watching them teach first. But the observations themselves were not part of the research. They formed the artifact which kind of unlocked that discussion. So it was an important precursor to the interviews. We then, once I'd looked at some of the materials, I was able to bring some smaller groups together, and I shared back some of the initial findings to make sure that I was accurately capturing their reflections. And then the final source of data I used was analysis of some personal narratives. So from the moment we met, after they did their portraits, I asked them to write a 2,000-word autobiography of their lives as teachers and of their experience of education. So from their first educational memories all the way through their teacher education to that particular point, all the different ways in which they'd thought and reflected and had been influenced in terms of thinking as a history teacher. And this then is the model that emerged from those qualitative interviews and using the lessons as objects, and through a study and analysis of their personal narratives. So all of that data was brought together, was coded. Shamas's constructive grounded theory was the way in which I approached the data analysis in order to build up a model which both allowed me to reflect back on the literature as well as drawing upon the different perspectives and ideas that came from the different teachers who were part of that. So the model I've got here then is the different ways in which this has been framed, and centrally here you'll see a number of cogs in a interlinked cogs, which represent different domains of professional knowledge, which I'll talk through with you. And then around the outside, you'll see it kind of sits within an ecosystem of different influences that have helped shape it and help continue to shape what that knowledge is. So there's kind of 4 different headings around the outside, the key here. So at the top, we've got what's called historical knowing. And we frame this in terms of the knowledge which teachers have of their substantive subject area. Now, I've worked with all sorts of teachers since developing this, science teachers, mathematical teachers, but it is about their understanding of the discipline that they're teaching. And that kind of falls into 2 particular areas. It is both about their knowledge of the past and of history. So how much they know of particular events, of particular individuals, of particular first order concepts like monarchy, church, conflict, industrial revolution, ways in which historians use terms to kind of group ideas together, significant ideas, and the dates and the details and the facts that fit within that. So that kind of whole narrative. And of course, that can be very partial, because your own history education can be very specialized, or it can be Eurocentric, it can be Anglocentric. It depends on where you've done your degree. So it's mapped out in that way. But also, very importantly, for history teachers, is also a kind of an understanding of the processes of history, how the discipline is organized. And by that we mean the use of historical evidence, the application of what we call second order concepts, like the process of change over time, an understanding of what chronology means and how that has played out in the past. The need to consider what we in the 21st century consider to be significant about our past compared to those in the 19th century, and how different historians and different media outlets and different politicians and different companies and advertisers use the past and interpret the past in different ways. So understanding interpretations. So seeing historical knowing in those 2 different areas is kind of key to that success and to the development of their professional knowledge, and grows over time and isn't static, is something that develops. Now that's specific to the history teacher, but alongside that are these other domains which through other research could be seen as kind of universal. Pedagogical knowing then is referring to how to teach, and it is about understanding some of the strategies and some of the techniques that we use in the classroom. So how to group pupils, whether to have them sitting individually or working in pairs, how to manage behavior management, how to engage them in the learning, what kind of questioning to use, when to use whole class teaching and when to get them working silently by themselves. It's how the class is organized and how the teacher uses different strategies and techniques to engage, stretch and challenge the learners they're working with. And that's, in this case, I'm talking about history, but would be in all subjects. Curriculum knowing falls into 2 parts. Curriculum knowing is both knowing the curriculum that you have to deliver. So what exams are, when those exams take place, what will be on the specification, what textbooks are recommended by the examination board, what the government expects at different levels of a pupil's development. That's part of their curriculum. But also alongside that, which is what Schulman identified, is this idea of what resources a teacher can draw upon. Now that's textbooks, but it's much broader than that now. It's what websites to recommend, it's what films might be viewed together, it might be about what props are used, whether to bring in some objects from the past in order to stimulate learning, when to look at maps, when to go and visit a site of historical interest. It's thinking about what can we draw upon in order to teach our subject. Below that we have knowing learners, which is about our understanding of who our learners are. And all education systems organise learners in different ways. That might be by prior attainment, it might be about gender, it might be about ethnicity, it might be about religious difference, and quite obviously across global systems, it's about age. So 11-year-olds are kept apart from 16-year-olds. There are different ways in which we divide our students according to these categories. But when working with the history teachers I had, we were looking at what did those students know about the individuals in the classroom. So what made the pupils tick in their class of 30? What did the pupils like to do? What didn't they like to do? When did they know they would work hard? And when would we kind of think these students are not going to be as focused? Contextual knowing, again, is in two areas, macro and micro. Contextual being, what is it like to teach in the 21st century? And then what's it like to teach in England in the 21st century? And then what's it like to teach in Sussex? And what's it like to teach in that particular school? So what's the school ethos? If it's a church school, how does that influence things? If it's a brand new school, how does the academization and the influence of a particular sponsor influence that school? And it's also about the classroom and the head teacher. So it's about what kind of context someone is working within. And then finally, I've used the term ideological knowing, but others use the term values, beliefs. It's about what we believe to be really important about education, what we think schooling is for, what we hope our young people will get out of that experience, how we believe the system should be organised. Some people in my country will not work in an independent school where people are fee paying. It's against their principles. In others, it's all they know, and they believe that's the right way to educate young people. But of course, in history, it's also about what kind of historian am I? Do I believe that as a feminist historian, we should ensure that every narrative and every topic we look at reflects the different experiences of gender throughout time? Or is it something where I believe that we need to educate young people about their place within the world, and so that they have an international perspective? These are all ideological beliefs which the teacher has. At the heart of this is what we call reflection, which Schoen's work on the reflective practitioner is what drives it, that kind of constant rethinking. This doesn't operate in a vacuum. Around the outside, we have our personal histories, so that's shaped by how we were taught history, and our experiences of being a pupil and learning about the past, and learning about that through our parents or families or communities, as well as through school. Formal learning, so all of my people were interviewed on formal training programs, PGCEs, and had done professional development programs. You'd expect those, but also there are two other areas that emerged. One was about informal learning, and that was basically the chance encounter in the class, in the corridor with another teacher, or what was discussed over lunch break, or how people relaxed at the end of the day and talked about their practice, or more recently, how they joined online communities of practice, where teachers in one country or one school can communicate with another about how to teach. And then finally, just as we have a knowledge of the education system and the environment we work in impacts on our experience of being a teacher. So if you think about now, we're all shaped by this kind of common experience of teaching remotely or teaching under COVID conditions. It's a way which is shaping our thinking as teachers today, which is uniquely universal in terms of having that impact at the same time. So these are some of the quotations, but for time wise, I'm going to move out some of those and just end with one other, very briefly, another example of a different project, which again is use artifacts. And this is my interest in kind of thinking about how teachers develop over time. And again, how can different artifacts help us understand what history teachers are doing? And I was influenced very early on when I came to the university by an article by Weber and Mitchell, which was called Drawing Ourselves. And it was looking at how different images in our material culture and in teaching and in media kind of shape our understanding of what a teacher is. And just instinctively, I used to get my beginning teachers to draw themselves at the beginning of the course as the kind of teacher that they imagined they were going to become at the end of the year. And then we would return to it a year late at the end of the program. So you can see a couple of examples there of some of the early versions that I got my teachers to do. They kind of just pulled their ideas. And it was quite a useful tool to get them thinking. And I wanted to kind of cue into this and think, okay, what kind of transition are they going through? I want to kind of study this in more detail. So what I did is I got them to draw the whole cohort. They drew themselves in September and returned to that in June. And this time I was queuing into kind of research, not about professional knowledge, but about the stages which beginning teachers go through from initially focusing on themselves and being focused on who they are, to a final stage where they start to think about the pupils and they start to think about the reality of what's happening in the classroom and starting to become competent to hopefully that end goal where they see their role and that relationship with their pupils being so much stronger, and they think about the pupils first rather than themselves as learners. So I tried this with my cohort and we used participants from across the partnership. And I just wanted to kind of illustrate it with a couple of artifacts that we use. And again, what they did was they drew these at the beginning and then at the end. And then we had an interview using these illustrations to kind of pick out what was happening. And this first one focuses on what the teacher thought was important about their personal characteristics that were key to them being a teacher. And what the kind of teacher they wanted to be. So it was about their ideas and their beliefs and their ways of working. Whereas in the second picture you can see here, it's reframed completely because the teacher is there, but the teacher is now part of a classroom in which the pupils are the focus of the discussion and are the focus of the drawing, about what they are thinking and about what they need and about what they learn, rather than what the teacher is. So there's this shift here about how the teacher views themselves. And although we don't have time, there's all around the outside, there are some of the core principles that we were working with across the program. And here's another one you can see. This one's of a male teacher thinking about himself and again about the qualities that he has. And then at the end, very clearly, you've got this kind of focus on the pupils at the heart of what they're doing. But around the outside, you can see their substantive and second order, where they're talking about the kinds of history that they need to engage with and about inquiry, whereas at the beginning, it was just knowledge that was at the heart of it. So you just see the shift. At the beginning, I tried to kind of illustrate this through the volume of the 24 and the size of these circles. At the center of their models is about their personal qualities and about classroom control. These are things that the literature talks about. You know, all teachers are worried about themselves and being resilient and controlling the classroom. And just around the outside, there were some reflections there about content knowledge, about being a history teacher and thinking a little bit about what the pupils were doing. But when we come to the next one, the focus is very much about how to teach the subject, and the knowledge of the learners is also privileged, really, really important part of that. And some other aspects come up, but the shift goes from thinking about themselves and their qualities to thinking about what is good knowledge as a history teacher and what do my what do my learners need? And that has a kind of really interesting then reflection on how we've started to use that. That was 2017, 2018. We've done it for a couple of years now as a way of working, but it really enriches those conversations with the students as we came to understand the different stages that they were moving through. And it really helps us to kind of see what they considered to be important about their development. So instead of my questions leading the discussion in the interview, it all comes from the artifacts themselves. As a postscript, one of the things I started last year and unfortunately is paused at the moment is we shifted this. I was lucky enough to be involved in some training where the toy Lego was used in an educational training way, and I applied that to the same kind of ways of working. So instead of getting our students to draw themselves, we got them to model. We got them to model their understanding of what made good history teaching. And I'm just going to end by sharing with you the Padlet page of the kinds of drawings, the kinds of models that they created. So using these models, we started the process of them talking through what made good history teaching from their perspective. You can see all the little Lego models here, and there are little videos on the Padlet in which the teacher explains what they think is important about history teaching. Now, sadly, that was in September 2019, and we never returned together as a cohort in order to explain the follow-up. We did get them to do some more drawings, but we didn't come back to the Lego, so I haven't got that to report on. But I'm hoping that from September next year, I'll be able to apply this technique with the next cohort. Right, I'm just going to stop that share and share there. So these are some of the references that have been really key in terms of what I've been talking about. And then there's my email address should you have questions or want to follow up after today. I'd be very welcome to hear from you, hear more. If you wanted to find out a bit more and make connections, there's my email address. And yeah, well, thank you very much for listening.